in any conflict. Your fate will depend on your actions. War crimes will be prosecuted. War criminals will be punished. And it will be no defense to say, I was just following orders.
Universal Human Rights by Walden Bello. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. Honorable members of the Jury of Conscience and members of the panel of advocates. My brief here today is to outline and detail the specific charges against the coalition of the willing assembled by the United States government to support its aggression in Iraq. The case against the prime aggressor, the United States, has been laid out by other advocates. I will limit my statements to other members of the coalition, including the U.S. main partner, the government of the United Kingdom. The coalition of the willing was announced by the U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell shortly before the March 20, 2003 invasion. After the United States decided it lacked the votes to push through with the famous second resolution that would have authorized war in the United Nations Security Council. At its height in March 2004, the coalition had about 50 members, including the United States. 34 of these had troops deployed in Iraq. Various factors, most prominently armed attacks at home, the activities of the Iraqi resistance, political pressure from citizens, and international embarrassment, caused 15 countries to withdraw troops as of March 2005. Currently, there are about 23,900 non-U.S. coalition forces in Iraq, compared to the U.S. contingent of about 130,000 troops. Sure, okay. In the interest of time, the full paper dealing with many of the other members of the Coalition of the Willing has been presented to the body. What I would like to do here is to spend most of my time focusing on the special burden of guilt of the United Kingdom. And I will do this by first beginning with focusing on participation in the planning of the war, and then secondly, on the process of the war itself. The recently revealed Downing Street memos show that as early as April 2002, the Labour leadership in England was aware that, one, the Bush administration was keen to invade Iraq, two, that it was determined to do this on the issue of Saddam's possession of weapons of mass destruction, and three, that the evidence of Saddam's ability to develop weapons of mass destruction was tenuous. As one Foreign Office memo dated March 22, 2002, addressed to Foreign Secretary Jack Straw put it, and I quote, "The truth is that what has changed is not the pace of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction programs, but our tolerance of them post 19th of September, unquote. It continued, and I quote, "But even the best survey of WMD programs will not show much advance in recent years on the nuclear, missile, or chemical or biological weapons fronts. The programs are extremely worrying, but have not, as far as we know, been stepped up," unquote. Despite the fragility of the evidence for the existence of weapons of mass destruction, however, Prime Minister Tony Blair beat the drums for war based on the WMD argument. At around the same time that the Downing Street memos were questioning the WMD evidence, Blair told the House of Commons on April 10, 2002, and I quote, "Saddam Hussein's regime is despicable, he is developing weapons of mass destruction, and we cannot leave him doing so unchecked," unquote. On September 24, 2002, again contradicting the evidence, he declared, and I quote, The intelligence service concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, that Saddam has continued to produce them, that he has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated in 45 minutes, including his own Shia population, and that he is actively trying to acquire nuclear weapons capability, unquote. On February 25, 2003, in the lead up to the invasion, and I quote, "The intelligence is clear. Saddam continues to believe his WMD program is essential both for internal repression and for external aggression," unquote. Then, on the very day of invasion, March 20, 2003, Blair said, and I quote, "If the only means of achieving the disarmament of Iraq of weapons of mass destruction is the removal of the regime, then the removal of the regime has to be our objective," unquote. It now appears that a concerted effort by the Blair government to produce evidence of Iraq's possession of WMD led to the doctoring, or as the British Broadcasting Corporation put it, and I quote, "the sexing up of the British intelligence service 50-page dossier on Saddam's alleged WMD program released in September 2002. This dossier served as one of the key British government documents to make the case for war. Caught in the crossfire between pressure from the government and the slimness of the evidence, senior government scientist Dr. David Kelly, a former WMD inspector in Iraq, revealed to the press his strong doubts about the dossier's allegations, particularly the claim that Iraq could activate WMDs within 45 minutes. This apparently triggered government pressure on him that eventually led to his suicide in July 2003. The Downing Street memos also indicate that even as the WMD evidence was thin or non-existent, the Blair government was strongly for invading Iraq to institute regime change, quote unquote, though that was not something it could trumpet publicly, for that would be advocating a clear breach of international law. Indeed, as early as March or April 2002, a time that the Blair government and the Bush administration say they were not engaged in war planning, they were already at an advanced stage in the process. While the British government was not convinced of the threat of WMD, the memos reveal that it shared the Bush administration's desire for regime change through military means. One memo, Christopher Mayer, then British ambassador to the United Nations, says this fairly clearly in a discussion with Paul Wolfowitz, and I quote, "We back regime change, but the plan had to be clever and failure was not an option. It would be a tough sell for us domestically and probably tougher elsewhere in Europe." When all is said and done, it is clear that it was mainly Tony Blair, against the wishes of the vast majority of the British people, and a significant section of his party that brought the United Kingdom to war. Why? Some commentators say that he really did believe in the morality of externally imposed regime change, which makes him, like George Bush, a very dangerous man instead. Others would discount morality and say that Blair was in fact motivated by cold realpolitik. My sense is that, along with a warped morality, this is a likely motivation: the desire to put the British government at the center of global power alongside the United States. As Blair once asserted, and I quote, "It's my job to protect and project British power," unquote. Carrying out the war. In addition to its role in planning the war, the British government's conduct of the war in Iraq clearly reveals its disregard for international law and universally recognized human rights. The invasion of the country was preceded by a bombing campaign that began approximately 10 months before, in May 2002. Jets of the Royal Air Force joined U.S. Air Force jets in what were called spikes of activity designed to goad the Saddam Hussein regime into retaliating and thus providing the pretext for war. These actions, which were justified by U.S. officials, such as Allied Commander General Tommy Franks, as necessary to, quote, degrade, unquote, Iraq's air defenses, were not authorized by any United Nations resolution. And this illegal activity was further intensified at the end of August 2002, following a meeting of the U.S. National Security Council, where its purpose was revealed to be that of making Iraq's air defenses as weak as possible for a possible invasion. This was the war before the war. Since the invasion took place, Britain has sent some 65,000 British troops, or almost a third of the armed forces, to participate in an illegal war unauthorized by the United Nations. About 8,760 troops were stationed there as of March 2005. The main assignment for British troops was to secure the southern sector, notably the city of Basra. That campaign was marked by the deaths of scores of Iraqi civilians. Some of the deaths were caused by the use of cluster bombs, known to be deadly to civilian populations. Although officials at the British Ministry of Defense initially pledged not to use the weapons in and around Basra, Human Rights Watch documented several strikes using cluster munitions in the neighborhoods of that city. At the height of military operations in March and April 2003, British forces used 70 air-launched and 2,100 ground-launched cluster munitions, including 113,190 submunitions. Total US and British use of cluster bombs came to 13,000 cluster munitions and 2 million submunitions in that period. Foreign occupation invites systematic abuses of human rights. This has been the case in the US occupation in central and northern Iraq. Abu Ghraib prison has become a synonym for violations of the Geneva Convention, torture as a policy, and systematic sexual abuse. While the American retaking of Fallujah in November to December 2004 has become a contemporary reenactment of the harsh Roman order, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. The British occupation of Basra and southern Iraq, while being less in the glare of publicity than the US occupation, has also been marked by violations of basic human rights. 1 year of occupation yielded numerous cases of the killing and wounding of civilians by British troops. Amnesty International reports that as of early 2004, March, British authorities admitted that UK forces had been involved in the killing of 37 civilians. They acknowledge, however, that the figure was not comprehensive. In a number of cases investigated by Amnesty, British soldiers opened fire and killed Iraqi civilians in circumstances where apparently no threat of death or serious injury to themselves or others existed. Amnesty found that British Royal Military Police was, quote, highly secretive and provided families with little or no information about the progress or conclusions of investigations. Torture and sexual abuse of prisoners have been another black mark on the British occupation. In January 2005, photos were released in the international press depicting torture and systematic abuse of Iraqis by soldiers belonging to the 1st Battalion of the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. As described in one report, and I quote, one of the photographs showed a grimacing Iraqi civilian bound tightly in an army cargo net being suspended from a forklift driven by a British soldier. A second depicted a soldier dressed in shorts and a t-shirt standing on the bound and tied body of an Iraqi civilian. Other pictures showed 2 naked Iraqi men being forced to simulate anal sex and 2 Iraqis forced to simulate oral sex, unquote. The soldiers were court-martialed, leading to a jail sentence and expulsion from the army of some of them. There was, however, a grave miscarriage of justice at the trial, since evidence from the victims were not allowed in court, which could have led to harsher sentences or the implication of many more soldiers, including higher-ups. The evidence included that of the Iraqi in the forklift incident, Hassan Abdul Hussein, who said he was tied up and strung up when he refused to sever another Iraqi's finger with a knife. Why was the evidence inadmissible? Mr. Phil Shiner, who is also part of this panel of advocates, has charged that the purpose was, as in the case of the abuses at Abu Ghraib, damage limitation. And I quote Mr. Shiner, here, there is the clearest evidence that the military are incapable of prosecuting and investigating themselves. If they are allowed to, all we get is a whitewash and a few bad apples thrown to the dogs. Clearly, here, something has gone badly wrong. Officers were involved and a whole lot of people were abused, unquote. With British soldiers participating in the abuse of civilians, it is not surprising that they failed to provide security as they were required to by international law. Like other parts of the country, Basra and other sites in southern Iraq have witnessed scores, possibly hundreds of people deliberately killed by individuals or armed groups for political reasons, including for perceived moral infractions such as the selling and buying of alcohol. However, no investigation or prosecution of these killings had occurred as of early 2004. Thus, Amnesty considered the United Kingdom military authorities as in breach of its international obligations under Article 27 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which mandates the UK as an occupying power to provide protection for Iraqis, especially from threats and acts of violence. With the occupation provoking the rise of an armed resistance in 2003 and 2004, British troops were dragged in to support US military operations. The most notorious instance of indirect British support for US efforts to crush the Iraqi people's resistance took place in November 2004 when the 850-strong Black Watch Regiment was moved from southern Iraq to Babil province south of Baghdad. The redeployment followed a request from US military authorities who wanted to use the US military units freed up for the assault on the city of Fallujah that was to be launched after the US elections. The move provoked former British Foreign Minister Robin Cook to speak about, quote, the suspicion that we sent a third of the British Army to Iraq not in pursuit of our own national interest, but in support of the White House's political agenda, end quote. The ensuing US assault on Fallujah was marked by hundreds of civilian deaths, thousands of people injured, routine violations of human rights by American soldiers, such as the killing of wounded prisoners, and massive destruction of property. By redeploying British troops to release American soldiers for the savage attack, Mr. Blair's government must take some responsibility for the ensuing war crimes. Yes. The record of the coalition of the willing in Iraq is a sordid and sorry one. It tried to do the impossible, provide legitimacy to a glaring and unjustifiable violation of international law. The invasion of Iraq, an act that must rank as low in terms of ignominy and infamy as the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939. The 50 members of the coalition of the willing have performed for the US today what the Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian fascist states did for Nazi Germany in the latter's aggressive and brutal conquest of Eastern Europe during the Second World War. Thus, the coalition must be willing, must be seen, all 50 members of it, as complicit not only in the violation of Iraqi sovereignty, but also in the systematic violation of human rights, political rights, and economic rights that is the main feature of the US and British occupation of that country today. Among coalition members, the role of the government of the United Kingdom must be especially condemned. The Blair government's role cannot be reduced to that of being a reluctant partner of the Bush administration. It cannot be reduced to that of a supporter that merely provides convenient cover for the aggressor. The Blair government actively participated in the preparations and conduct of the war. It committed a third of the British Army to the invasion and occupation and went to war willingly. Gleefully, some would say, in the case of Prime Minister Blair. Mr. Blair's behavior went beyond that of a cheerleader to that of being one of the main apologists for the war, trying to convince the world that an immoral and illegal war was a moral one. Like Bush and like Hitler, he is, as we said earlier, a very dangerous man. Harsh censure by this body must be meted to all members of this coalition, including those that did not deploy troops to Iraq. For those that deployed troops to Iraq in support of the US war, the appropriate punishment is to be arraigned before international legal bodies for prosecution for complicity in the breach of international law and internationally recognized human rights. Officials of the British government, in particular Prime Minister Anthony Blair, must be given top priority for prosecution alongside President George Bush and other civilian and military leaders of the US government in the appropriate legal institutions, in particular the International Criminal Court. The war criminals, ladies and gentlemen and members of the jury, must be brought to trial, and soon. I thank you very much.
ehline helaldir, ha ehle haram. Biz içeriz, bize yoktur vebali. Sevap almak için içeriz şarap. Sevap almak için içeriz şarap. İçmezsek oluruz düçarı azap. Senin aklın ermez, bu başka